I want to talk today about the origins of the space age, and in particular, the way in which Russians, the Soviet Union and Russia, was at the forefront of creating the space age, a little bit of explanation for why this was the case. And first, by way of introduction, I just want to say a few things about why we're talking about space technology. This image itself, it's from outside Moscow. I took this photo a couple years ago when I was in Russia doing research for my history of the first man in space and history of space age collaboration. And this is a titanium, in part titanium installation, which represents, I think, the hopes associated with space age triumph. This kind of parabola, or this curving rocket that's ascending into beyond Earth's atmosphere, into orbit, perhaps even to other planets. This embodied, I think, this hope that space exploration would finally sort of blow up all limits to growth and to human possibilities. So associated with space age exploration was the hope of unlimited potential. The sky's the limit, quite literally, embodied, I think, by this particular image that you see in front of you. So let me talk a little bit about how it is the Russians drove us into space. One of the curious things about Russia as the country that would lead the world into space is that it was, in European terms, the most backward of all the European countries. And certainly in comparison to the United States, quite backwards from the 1920s, 30s, 40s, and 50s up and through the beginning years of the space age. So why is it that this backward country would be the one that would lead the way into space? Well, I think one of the explanations for that, the big explanation, is precisely because it was so aware of its backwardness. That in Russian culture, even before the revolution of 1917, through the 1600s, 1700s, and 1800s, had envisioned travel into the air and into space as a kind of way of transcending the daily conditions and misery of everyday life. Among peasants, for example, who had it very hard in Russia, there was a very common kind of myth, a sort of urban myth of what the Russians called the Russian peasant Icarus. Icarus, of course, is from Greek mythology. It's about that figure who tries to put on wings and to fly, representing the hope of all human beings that we often see in our dreams, to fly above our problems and above the world. And it ultimately ends tragically when the wax that he has put on his wings melts as he gets closer to the sun, and he crashes into the earth. The Russian peasant Icarus was a peasant who tried to master the technology of air flight, indeed to create it. In one version of this myth, Ivan the Terrible, who was a 16th century czar of Russia, punished the peasant by having the peasant horribly, hideously tortured and then executed. There's another version of the Russian peasant Icarus, current during the time of Peter the Great. In this case, Peter the Great, who wanted to modernize Russia at all costs, borrowing Western science and technology, had commanded a peasant to develop this technology of air flight. And when the peasant did not succeed, the peasant was punished. At any rate, for purposes of what I'm trying to discuss here, the popularity of the idea of spaceflight within the kind of traditional Russian peasant village embodied the hopes associated with spaceflight as something that could help people transcend their miserable existence. And I think for many decades, the space age was associated indeed with a kind of leap into a much better utopian future. Not something that I think most of us would agree with today, but certainly earlier on in the 20th century and even in earlier decades, space flight was very much associated with hopes for transcendence, I'll put it that way. Here's an image that I took, a picture in the museum devoted to the first man in space, Yuri Gagarin, who flew into space April 12, 1961. I wrote a book about him, biography of him. I visited the places where he lived, the museum in this case, and the place where he grew up, a little impoverished town in western Russia that produced this person that would lead Russia into this glorious scientific and technological future. Here's someone's fanciful representation of his feat in April 12, 1961. you see Gagarin flying over a traditional village. You have all the old women offering their flowers to him, the backward village without modern technology, and here is Gagarin flying over them, representing the hopes that they would be able to transcend the miserable conditions of their existence and get into space. It is this desire to transcend, which is very much responsible, I think, for explaining why it is that Russia, of all places, was the one to lead us into space. Of course, you needed the technology as well. Associated with this was a long tradition beginning in the 1800s of the belief that space would be associated with human immortality. There was a guy, kind of a wacky, mystical, religious thinker, who then said that, concluded from developments in modern science and technology, that soon science and technology would provide the key to human immortality. And this would be consistent, indeed would be fulfillment of the plan that God had for us. So that finding the key to human immortality was part and parcel of God's plan for us, and he was an instrument for realizing that plan. He also believed that we would solve the problem of human immortality at the point at which we would leave the Earth and populate other planets. So, associated with human spaceflight was also using science and technology to solve the problem of human immortality. This became a kind of leitmotif, a major theme in Russian popular culture, and also was something that many engineers and scientists in Russia at some level bought into or had been exposed to, and therefore it became an inspiration for them. There was another Russian revolutionary figure named Nikolai Kovalchich, interesting because he was a terrorist. He participated in the construction, using science and technology, of bombs that blew up Tsar Alexander II in 1881. He was arrested when the conspirators were caught. And what did he do when he was awaiting hanging in his jail cell? He sketched out a modern jet engine, or at least the plans for it, the technical plans. Here you see the connection between revolution, overturning that old order, and the construction of new technology that would get us into the air. In Russian culture, these things were very much associated with each other. The use of science and technology to get us to a better future, and the use of violence to eliminate everything is preventing reason, science, and technology from reigning triumphant. Another figure known as Konstantin Tsiolkovsky, who was referred to in Russia as the father of Soviet rocketry, he developed at the end of the 1800s and beginning of the 1900s the basic mathematical equations that proved, indeed became the foundation for modern rocket science. Tsiolkovsky's equations were necessary in order to build a rocket that could escape from Earth's atmosphere, get into the orbit of Earth, and even beyond. But Tsiolkovsky was also a mystical thinker who bought into those ideas I talked about before. He believed that the colonization of space would be associated with the solution to the problem of human immortality using modern science and technology. According to him, individuals, once we learn how to resurrect human life, individuals would begin to resurrect their parents. Their parents would be resurrected, and in turn would resurrect their parents using these modern techniques, and so on and so forth, going perhaps all the way back to the Garden of Eden. Now, the problem with human immortality from Tsiolkovsky's point of view, and with resurrecting all the people that had died, was that you'd have no place to put them. Where do you put them? On other planets. Hence the need for the colonization of space. So at the same time that he's developing the practical sort of technology to get us into space, the mathematical equations that you can prove that you need to do that, at the same time he's doing that, he is this kind of wacky, romantic, starry-eyed thinker who is thinking about all sorts of incredible things that are going to happen in the future. These ideas were very much embedded within the Russian Revolution. People who believed that the future was destined to have human beings living on other planets also believed in human immortality. The father of the Russian Revolution, Vladimir Lenin, when he died, his body was pickled and preserved. It still is to this day on Red Square. And that was a reflection of the confidence, the belief that science and technology held the key to human immortality. And then, in fact, once we figured out how to make human beings immortal, we could resurrect the particularly good and great ones so that they could continue to do good works to build a better future. Lenin, of course, according to the Russians, was one of those who would have to be resurrected. I believe in the United States we have Ted Williams, whose head is cryogenically frozen in the hope that someday the great baseball player and batter can be resurrected and perhaps play for the hapless these days Yankees. Here's another image of Tsiolkovsky with his rocket enabling equations in the background. He's very much an icon in Russia to this day and rightfully considered to be the father not only of Russian rocketry, but of rocketry more generally. He was a science fiction writer, Tsiolkovsky, so he's developing these equations that prove that rockets can get us into space, and at the same time, Tsiolkovsky is also imagining future perfect worlds, kind of like Sir Thomas More and the utopian tradition that we discussed earlier in science fiction works. Practically speaking, there was a guy named Sergei Korolyov who was the father, the actual engineer who created the rockets based on the equations that Tsiolkovsky himself had produced. Korolyov was, of all things, arrested by Stalin and put into Stalin's prison camps in Siberia. He was horribly beaten. And then during World War II, when it became apparent that the Nazis were building rockets to use as military weapons, what Stalin did is he went to the prison camps where there were many engineers and scientists holed up and arrested unjustly in an earlier period, and he said, you can get your freedom back by working for Russia and developing new technology. And in particular, he said to Korolyov, if you develop a copy of the German V-2 rocket, you will be free, and you will be able to redeem yourself for the revolution in Soviet society. So, developing a new rocket is a way that an engineer can show that he has a place in this new society. Wernher von Braun was a Nazi. That was not part of his official biography when he joined NASA, but he was part of the German V-2 rocket effort that much of which became the foundation for Russia's rocket program when World War II ended, and for NASA's rocket program as well. The Rocket Man later on featured in popular culture in the United States, and here he is as a Nazi. By the way, this is one of the only pictures of von Braun that shows him in a Nazi uniform. He meticulously and carefully made sure that all evidence of his Nazi past would be destroyed so that when he joined NASA after World War II, people would not know about his Nazi origins. It's a kind of footnote that thanks to the Nazis, the United States was able to get into space, and also thanks to the Nazi technology, the Russians were also able to get into space when they acquired much of that technology in defeating the Germans in World War II. Now, subtext to all of this is that the reason that the United States and the Soviet Union developed space technology was not to explore the cosmos so much, but to develop an intercontinental ballistic missile. In other words, the ability to deliver a weapon, a nuclear weapon, across the oceans and to drop it on your enemy. A key moment in the realization of the dream of spaceflight, artificial satellite, October 4th, 1957, known as Sputnik, which in Russian means fellow traveler, Sputnik. That was launched in 1957, and with that date officially begins the space age, initiated by the Russians. Again, the military subtext to all of that, the reason that people were so terrified by Sputnik in the United States is that it showed that if you could put a basketball-sized artificial satellite on top of a rocket and have it be in orbit around the Earth, you could also just as well turn that object into a nuclear bomb, put it on top of a rocket, and lob it at the United States. First dog went into space shortly after Sputnik, a dog named Laika. Poor little Laika died a horrific death in space as a result of her trip. She never returned. She was celebrated in Russian stamps, in statues. By the way, if you do a search on Laika on Google, you will come up with millions and millions and millions of hits. Laika is indeed a kind of heroic canine sacrifice for progress. And then, of course, this image of Yuri Gagarin as a kind of transformer. The first man in space, April 12th, 1961. So that's a brief summary of the factors that led to the beginning of the space race, and the factors also that contributed to Russia, of all places, being the one that would lead the world into space.